Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this Kulluna Irada policy discussion. We gather today 1 year after the ceasefire agreement, which unlocked the institutional stalemate in Lebanon, culminating in the election of President Joseph Aoun and the appointment of Prime Minister Nawaf Salam. This new leadership has three overarching and deeply interconnected priorities: disarmament, reform, and reconstruction. While our focus today is on reform, three things are clear. First, no reform will be possible or sufficient without proper disarmament. Second, both disarmament and reform will be prerequisites for reconstruction. And third, there are no shortcuts to reform, either structural reforms that will allow us to kickstart growth and grow our economy again, or Lebanon's economy will be stuck at a very low level and the country will continue to lose its people. So today, what we aim to cover is a deep dive on what is happening at the level of economic reforms specifically. Definitely, the current government faces a short and decisive window for action, ideally, of course, before the next legislative elections scheduled for May. Any postponement of these elections will also intensify the pressure on the administration to deliver, but also as we get closer to election time, it is obvious reform will get tougher, decisions will be more politically motivated, and it will get nearly impossible to actually pass any reformist legislation in Parliament as we get closer to election day. So what can we expect from now until mid-May? With us today are two guests. We're very much looking forward to the discussion with both of you. Allow me to introduce our guests. First, Ishac Diwan. Ishac Diwan is a professor, is a research director at FinDevLab, Paris School of Economics, is a professor of economics at the AUB, and is a member of Kulluna Irada. Thank you, Ishac, for joining us.
Happy to.
And with us also is Mike Azar. Mike is the Senior Vice President, the Debt Advisory at Greengate LLC, and a professor at Johns Hopkins. Mike, thank you for joining us, and looking forward to the discussion with both.
Thank you.
So if you could first start with
Recording in progress.
May I ask everyone to mute themselves except for the speakers? Thank you. So if we may start with the framing of the situation. We know that there are three key pieces of legislation that are the cornerstone of the economic reform agenda that the Lebanese are waiting for, and that also the international community has been pressuring Lebanon and the government of Lebanon to deliver on, and that the IMF has set as prerequisites for a program with Lebanon. The first is the lifting of bank secrecy. We know that an amended piece of legislation was issued a few months ago in that effect. We are still waiting for the implementing decrees. The second is the bank resolution law. We know that a law was issued by Parliament, but that also a draft bill to amend this law further was sent from the Council of Ministers to Parliament. It has yet to be discussed in Parliament, of course, and issued. And the third is the gap law, which is still under discussion, which we have not seen a draft yet. The Prime Minister has indicated last week, and also the Minister of Finance and other ministers have indicated that we can expect a draft to soon be on the table of the Council of Ministers. We're going to be discussing today what are the key elements of this draft. And of course, the big challenge will be first getting it out of the Council of Ministers, but the next and much bigger challenge will be getting a gap law approved by Parliament. Ishac, we will start with you and discuss first the gap law. What are, at a high level, because we know also that the discussions have progressed on the gap law. We know that there are certain elements of the law that, more or less have been agreed upon, but also that there are other contentious elements that remain pending. What are the contours of this gap law? What has been agreed upon, and what are the issues that remain pending? Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Good to be on this call, although I see many participants that know much more than me, but I will do my best to engage. This has been such a difficult process, right? We're here 6 trying to resolve the banking crisis, and clearly it's a very complicated situation with so many losses to divide. And as we start seeing the contours, which by the way are not too different from what the previous government and Saad Shami had worked out, or even what earlier others had worked out. But as we get deeper into the pieces of the puzzle, you start seeing how each one is complex, each piece, and each one requires a certain balance. And as you disturb this balance, like a balloon, if you like, you're pushing air somewhere else, and it disturbs the big jigsaw puzzle. But anyway, I think there's been some good progress. We clearly have a government that is trying, that has already sent 2 laws to Parliament, second being fixed, as you said. But it's a progressive government trying to solve that issue, and I hope that it will be solved. We're on the right route, if you like. I see several points of convergence that are clearer than in the past. There's a clear point that the small depositors will be fully repaid, and I think there is a broad agreement that it's feasible to do it up to $100,000 per depositor. There's been some debates whether it's depositors or account, and there's still some debates as to whether it's the small depositors or all depositors, but that's a point of convergence. There's a clear convergence that larger depositors will be paid through time, over time, at low interest, and therefore, maybe the face value would be repaid, but with a smaller present value. And this has been a point of contention and of kind of populistic pronouncement, but nevertheless, that seems to be the ultimate solution found. There is an agreement to reduce deposits by what is called anomalies, and there is a list of anomalies being discussed, and this is where details are being negotiated or discussed before sending them to Parliament. I think there is a convergence on the hierarchy of claims. There are differences in how to apply it, whether in particular these anomalies, all of them, part of them, will be eliminated before you go to equity or not. We can discuss that in more detail. It seems to me there is an agreement now that, whether the crisis is systemic or not, everybody will have to pay their share, and that there will be some support from the Treasury to the resolution. The big question is going to be gold, no gold. We can talk about it later. And at least there are pronouncements by all the parties that they want an IMF program. So that's a lot of convergence, and it does put a structure around that deal, where now you have to fix the various pieces, and you have to ensure that you can finance that, given that the government has other financial obligations, as you said, reconstruction, but also the Eurobond issue, and increasing the wages in the public sector and many other obligations. Let me stop here for getting this started.
Thank you, Ishac. So you flagged a set of issues. You flagged the fact that depositors, up to actually $100,000 will be repaid to all depositors. Please correct me if there's anything that I misrepresented. Second, you highlighted that there is convergence around the hierarchy of claims. We'll discuss this later. I want to also, it's very good news if that is the case. And it's a very important piece of information. We need to discuss this further. You definitely highlighted that there's an issue on the decision on how and whether to use the gold or not, and on the need or no need for an IMF program. We'll be discussing all of these subtopics, but you also referred to anomalies. By anomaly, what do you mean by anomalies? Can you please clarify that? Do you mean the accounts that are ineligible? And how are those being defined before we move to you, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, first, let me clarify that I'm not part of decision-making process at all. It's just that I have some friends, and so once in a while I hear some news, but it's nothing official there. You know, the anomalies were present in the previous draft of Saad Shami. These are, you know, the accounts that are ineligible, as you say. Now, there are various parts of that. There are accounts that contain illegal money, and that's the easy way. I mean, the easy part. Question is about execution. How do you verify? There are accounts where say they were transferred from pounds to dollars after the cutoff rate. So one could think that there were kind of preferential treatments received. And then there is talk, and as there was talk before, that some of the very high interest that they were paid will be clawed back as well. And there may be a few other categories as well. And this is all, if I understand, under discussion where you put exactly the balance between what's feasible and what's not. Now, the total amount sounds quite large, you know, $20 to $30 billion. And so the fear is that some of that would be contested in courts later and would become a bit of like a contingent liability, if you like, that would wait on the financial system. And so this is where the balance is important. If you go too far, it may be contested legally. It may be hard to execute. And if you don't do it, at the same time, if you can reduce the losses by 30 billion, that enormously simplifies the process of redistributing the rest of the losses.
Thank you, Ishac. Mike, first of all, any comments? Would you like to add anything? And second, can we maybe talk a bit about the issue of the hierarchy of claims? Can you first of all explain the concept, explain whether any restructuring has happened without respecting the hierarchy of claims? Has any IMF program happened before without respecting the hierarchy of claims? And what does that really entail? Because we're hearing a lot today that if the bank's equity is compromised or wiped out completely, then this actually means that depositors will be negatively affected. Is that true?
Thanks.
And what does that really mean? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Diana. I think the way I see it is that, at least based on my observation since 2019, the challenges have always been around the details. So I think, to my mind, there's never really been a debate around giving preferential treatment to a certain class of depositors, or that the government needs to contribute in some way, and that the bank shareholders have to contribute in some way. To me, the problem has always been, what are the numbers around those? So when we talk about the government contribution, that always was going to be the case. But what is the amount of that contribution? Because then that determines how much your depositors ultimately will be recovering, and also whether you're creating kind of a post-restructuring world where you don't have so much debt that the economy will just never grow. Same with the bank shareholder contribution. I mean, if you remember where we were back in 2020, we were talking about bail-ins, we were talking about clawing back dividends and management compensation. We were talking about wiping out, writing down the equity. Today, that window has moved very significantly, and I think the question of the hierarchy of claims, at least as it pertains to this very specific scenario, is really about how much do the existing bank shareholders need to contribute, period. regardless of what terms they used, are used to describe this issue, because they will tell you we are respecting the hierarchy of claims. We're just removing the, illicit or ineligible deposits first, and then we respect the hierarchy of claims. So it's kind of a word play. But I think the way I see it in a very simple way is that at the end of the day, you're going to need to figure out how much can your government contribute to this process. And that's just going to be a modeling exercise that will give you a number based on, the government's forecast for economic growth, for fiscal revenue, expenses, the budget, which, by the way, we haven't seen yet. And it's been 9 months. And this is such critical data that it basically needs to underpin the entire restructuring process. We haven't seen that, but that's you figure out how much the government can contribute. We know how much the BDL can contribute because we know what assets it has, and then once you do that, you end. Well, I mean, the BDL has whatever it is, 12 billion of reserves now, 35 billion of gold, and they have a bunch of other liabilities other than just to the deposits, or to the banks, that is. But that's a calculation that can be done. Once you do that, you end up with two stakeholders left, the depositors and the existing bank shareholders. Whatever dollar one of those contributes, the other one doesn't have to. So the way I see it, every dollar of shareholder equity that does not get written off mathematically must translate to a dollar a depositor dollar that must be written off. It's just a mathematical formula because you've already determined how much your government and the BDL can contribute. So, I think people need to decide, and I think the government needs to be frank with people. If they go down the path of allowing the banks to retain some equity in the banks, and by the way, this is not even going into the topic of are we even measuring the bank's assets correctly, which could ultimately lead to the existing shareholders retaining much more equity than today we think they are. But that's a different topic. Now, I think looking forward, as any investor in a country or lender in a country, the topic of hierarchy of claims is very critical because, I mean, in my day job, we come into countries as senior lenders, and we'll make very large investments, offer a lower interest rate because we assume that the country will respect the hierarchy of claims and that us who are accepting a lower interest rate and therefore supposedly taking a lower risk are not going to be treated worse than another investor who's earning double the interest rate that we are. We offer the lower interest rate because we expect to be treated preferentially. These are some of the long-term, I think, consequences of giving the impression that you're not respecting the hierarchy of claims. But at the end of the day, putting all of this language aside, it's really a matter of how much are the bank shareholders expected to cover versus how much the depositors are expected to cover. And it's really a 1-for-1. Hopefully that was clear. It's quite a complicated, mathematical topic to describe.
Thank you, Mike. That is clear. So unlike the narrative that is being promoted today, actually, shareholders contributing and equity being affected does not mean that depositors will be negatively affected. On the other hand, actually the opposite is true.
Yes. What just to play a bit of devil's advocate, I mean, what the banks are arguing is that if you wipe out all of our equity, we'll have to contribute new capital of, let's say, $3 billion. If you write down only half of our equity, we'll only need to contribute $1.5 billion of new capital. We can do $1.5 billion, we can't do $3 billion. So if you force us to do $3 billion, we'll just hand you the keys and you can deal with it. That's the leverage that the banks are using and to threaten that's the leverage. By handing in the keys, they think depositors will be worse off because there won't be a bank there. But at the end of the day, the depositors are just getting the assets of the bank, so they shouldn't really be any worse off.
Thank you, Mike. I think this is clear. So we've addressed one of the key issues that are pending, that is the hierarchy of claim. Ishac, I see you want to add something to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to comment. I think Mike took us interesting places First of all, it's true we've been going in circles over the same issues for many, many years. But I think we have to be fair and recognize that this is not the Miati government that we have here. We don't have a prime minister that owns shares in banks and other ministers that are closely associated with the banks. We have a different regime right now that has already sent 2 laws to parliament and passed the secrecy law, which is a huge deal because nothing can be done without it. And we can't collect proper income taxes without it. So we are on a path for change. I mean, I think we have to be a bit less cynical and a bit more constructive to try to get to the end of that. Now, Mike is totally right on the 2 issues he put on the table. First of all, that we do need to look at the bigger picture. How much can the government actually put into this depends on macro framework, on growth path, on taxation, and we are late in developing a medium-term vision and framework. And actually, this is going to stop us because we can't solve the banking crisis alone. We have 3 crises; they are interrelated. There's the bank crisis, there's the external debt, Eurobond crisis, and there's the currency crisis. You know, what do we do with the central bank and with the currency? And whatever financing is available has to go to these 3, plus the reconstruction, of course. Now, it's related. I mean, let's say we can, if we imagine we're going at that rate, at the end of the reform process, say, of the fund program, our GDP would be a certain amount. Our debt to GDP will have to go down to something sustainable, let's say 75% or 100%. We have to agree on that. That gives us an amount of debt that we could issue that is sustainable. It has to be divided between the banking sector, the Eurobonds, and new loans that we need to take to help that country grow and have these ratios. So it's a more complicated puzzle overall, and we're making some progress on one part, but alone it's not enough. We have to, it will get stuck. At some point where we make enough progress, we'll have to go back to the big picture. One last point on the hierarchy of claim. It is true, and we can talk more about it, that now the debate is over what part of these illegal, or whatever you call them, deposits can be eliminated before or after. And the discussion with the fund could be on whether some part could be eliminated before equity, for example, the illegal money, but not the clawback on interest, because that has to come after equity is taken out. And he's exactly correct on saying that the discussion now seems to be around whether to leave $1 or $1.5 billion to some banks. Now, this is bank by bank treatment, by the way, so it's not the total that matters. Some banks are in better shape than others and may end up with a few, some money, and then of course they have to recapitalize and bring more in order to sustain, the capital base of the bank. But it's important to see where we are. I mean, the big disagreement with the fund now is over $1 or $1.5 billion. We're talking of a $70 billion problem. So we're very close to the solution. And we can cut the pair in 2. We can back out completely. I don't think this is, at this stage, an issue that's unsolvable as it used to be in the past.
Thank you, Ishac. So what you're basically saying is that, just to sum it up, so you're saying that the discussion is still over what to cut from what is called today the illicit funds or الأموال غير المشروعة before you get to the equity, and what to cut after the equity. And this is the discussion. And what you are saying is basically that we're talking about $1 to $1.5 billion of equity. And the question today with the IMF is how to address this $1 to $1.5 billion. And of course, the IMF insists, in line with the hierarchy of claims and the international standards, that equity has to go first, whereas there are some propositions to address some deposits before addressing the equity, which means that the preferential treatment will go to shareholders, and here I'm interpreting, which means that the preferential treatment will go to shareholders who will get a preferential treatment over depositors who will take the hit before the shareholders. Is that accurate?
I mean, I think it's accurate, but again, it could be not any depositors, but the drug dealers. So the drug dealers were the shareholder. That may be the remaining issue.
Okay. Thank you, Ishac. This is clear. Mike, would you like to comment on this before we move to another topic, which is that of the gold and what to be and how it should be used?
I mean, just to say that perhaps I have less confidence than Ishac only because we haven't really seen what the plan is, and it's hard for me to speculate about, you know, what solutions will be put forward, because what I would like to see is details around the implementation of, you know, a feasible plan that will get us post-restructuring to have a banking system that's well capitalized, a central bank that has positive equity and is generating profits, and a government that has a sustainable debt level and space to borrow for investment that's sorely needed. So I don't, you know, I appreciate that these kind of details around, you know, the government contribution and the shareholder contribution is important. But there's a broader picture here that I have no visibility into, and nobody in Lebanon, perhaps only, you know, people in the government have visibility into, because the experience that I have is a bank restructuring law that passed the cabinet knowingly with deficiencies, that it would have to come back and be amended. A gap law that may follow the same path and may come out of the government and have deficiencies, not be implementable. And we may not know if it's implementable or not until, you know, until very far down the line. It's a roadmap with, you know, with multiple stages of successes that we need, and not just a law coming out of the cabinet, because, you know, I mean, that happened with the bank restructuring law. Look at the banking secrecy law. We noted that as a success. The implementing decrees haven't been written yet. So, you know, I need to see more progress, I think, more tangible progress in order to be more confident in the path that we're going down. And in fact, you know, having talked to, you know, bondholders after the, you know, over the last week, I think the general consensus is that, you know, nothing is really likely to happen before 1 or 2 years down the line. Not only because of the political and the security situation, but that the progress is much slower than I think people expected it to be.
Thank you, Mike. Ishac, I'd like to cover with you the issue of gold. How you think it should be addressed? Should the gold, like the big question, how should the gold be treated in all of this? And after that, I'd like to move to a more political dimension, just to try to understand what's at stake and what are the positions of the different stakeholders here. So over to you, Ishac, on the gold.
Okay, I mean, first, just to comment again on what we're talking about, we all would love to see a feasible plan, and hopefully, you know, what the government will put together would be a plan to send to Parliament. Now, of course, this is an explosive issue. Let's see how people would react and how different parties would react. And it's not going to be an easy stroll in Parliament. It's going to go through commission and be transformed and take a life on its own. And God knows whether it can be voted, you know, before the elections. We can talk about that. And so I would expect, and again, I have no information, that some of what is put on the table is also tactical. I don't think they would want to reveal all their cards. You know, maybe not put all the numbers together and see how the reactions are. So, you know, I think this is not just a plan that will go and there will be pressure from outside, like for the first law, and it would just be approved because it's just much more consequential. But I hope I'm wrong. The gold is exactly what makes it very complicated, because the price of gold has increased a whole lot. And, you know, when we used to do the Lebanon Inc. computation in the past, Mike, we would put $10-12 billion. Now it's $38 billion. And so, you know, at some point, the central bank thought that to solve the problem. Actually, its balance sheet was nearly whole with this gold. It was just missing a little bit. And so if the government would give me $16 billion, I'm whole. And so the deposits are whole. And so I can take them back bank by bank, and many of them are not actually insolvent anymore. But then you scratch your head that, the gold, you cannot use the gold. There's a law that says you cannot use the gold. So is it in? Is it out? It's an issue that's not clear. I mean, people would tell you it's out, but then you would look at their calculation, they're counting on it. To give you an example, when now, people talk about resolutions, they are not talking anymore about funds with assets, but rather about securities that would be issued by the central bank, right?
This is a very important point, Ishac. Can you provide us with details? So what you're saying is that today, because the discussion for the past 2-3 years has been around the creation of a fund that would contribute to actually increasing the recovery of depositors. What you're saying is that today the discussion has shifted from a discussion around fund to a discussion around securities, right?
Right. So instead of a fund, the new institutions, we have an institution, it will issue securities for the large depositors, several groups of large depositors, they'll be divided, 1 to 5 million, 3 groups, let's say, and they will be repaid over different periods with relatively low interest. And so there are several questions that arises. Where would the central bank get the liquidity to pay? Fine, it's rich, it has the gold, but it cannot use the gold. What is it supposed to sell the gold every time it services its new securities? Presumably not. And so from a liquidity perspective, we can imagine that the treasuries coming from the funds coming from treasuries, bonds, would provide enough liquidity possibly to pay the interest. But then how about the principal? And so, those treasuries in most likelihood would not be backed officially by gold, but they are somewhat backed unofficially. I think what I understand is that the hope is that those that receive these securities would think that there is a high probability of repayment because there is that gold, even though they are not formally connected to the gold. And so in a way, if that is what happens, that we're promising to pay more than what is backed by securities, we're kind of kicking the can down the road, hoping for the best in the future. The economy will grow fast, the treasuries will be able to pay, or we'll find a way to sweat that gold and get income from it, or things will go bad. Actually, these treasuries will sell very cheap, we'll buy them back, and somehow something will happen. And I'm uncomfortable with that, frankly, but as Mike said, we haven't seen anything precise. It's just that the gold is neither here nor there at this stage. It's part of the solution, it's a stock, but it's very hard to liquefy it.
Thank you, Ishac. Mike, would you like to add anything to this? I'd like to then move to the third point of contention, which is whether we should proceed with an IMF program or without an IMF program, because we know that there are a lot of discussions today on whether an IMF program is actually needed or whether we can do without one. So first of all, would you like to comment on what Ishac has just said? And second, please, I'd like your point of view regarding IMF, no IMF.
Yeah, I mean, on the gold, it's interesting. You have a law that's existed for a long time that says, the BDL can't use the gold, can't sell the gold, can't lease the gold. But de facto, they found a way to do that by basically accruing huge losses and making it politically impossible, in my opinion, politically impossible not to use the gold. Because kind of every analysis that's done, at least that I know of in the last 5 years, has assumed that the gold was going to be used to cover the losses at the BDL. If you somehow carve them out, then we don't have a $40 billion gap. We have an $80 billion gap. And in that case, the large depositors larger than 100,000 or the accounts, the value of the accounts above 100,000 are getting basically no recovery. So I don't see how practically that gets done, given the level of the government contribution that I think is really the maximum the government can contribute. We'll see, because you hear mixed signaling. Some ministers say we're not touching the gold. The way BDL is approaching its analysis, it assumes the gold is going to be backing the deposits, and a type of So that's all I'll say about that. We just have to see what they plan to do. Yeah.
Can you recap in simpler terms, Mike, please?
Sure. If I'm the central bank and I owe banks $40 billion, and the only thing I have on my balance sheet is 40 billion of gold, I could tell you every day I'm not using the gold to pay those deposits, but that's exactly what I'm doing, because that's the only asset I have to pay the gold. Now, you hear a lot of people saying, well, we don't have to sell the gold. We can use it in some way without selling it. The way you approach this is to say, there's an asset with value here, and who is getting the value of this asset? If it's the depositor or the bank, then it is effectively the same as selling the gold and giving the value to that creditor. Now, if you say, well, I'm not going to use the gold to cover these liabilities of 40 billion, then there's no place where that money can come from. And so those creditors are getting zero back. So, there's a lot of, I feel, and again, it's kind of hard to talk about it in isolation because we have no idea what the government is doing. But I think one thing that I'll be very aware of once we eventually get the gap law is the central bank going to use the gold to back the deposits? Because if they are, then we need to assume that the value of that gold now belongs to the depositors. It doesn't belong to the BDL anymore, because that's a creditor of the BDL, and that asset belongs to them. And if they're not going to use the gold, then where are the depositors going to get their recovery from? And whether there's kind of some wordplay, like for example, if they do something where they try to have this liability backed by gold, but without being able to actually use the gold to pay it, to me, that tells me that we actually haven't restructured the bank. We have a 40 billion gap still post-restructuring. But I know that people in government are too smart to do something like that, and so hopefully that's not what they're planning to do. But I think they just need to be very frank with people that if the idea is that the gold is going to back the liabilities on the BDL's balance sheet, that means we're using the gold to pay back the banks and therefore the depositors. Just need to be frank about that, I think.
Let's stay on the gold issue.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, but we're getting a bit too technical, and I'd like to also address other issues. If you want to say something, maybe very quickly, I want to move to the issue of IMF versus no IMF.
Azim. No, it's just to say that the gold issue is possibly not resolved at that stage, but it's going to explode in Parliament. I mean, this is going to be the big issue. And it seems to me there's very strong popular opposition to touching the gold. And it seems also to me that the minimum that large depositors can get without the gold is not nothing. But if, say, $10 billion come from the bank, from the treasury to the banks, another 10 billion, say, to the Eurobond holders, then you're getting a recovery value of 30%, 25, 30%, which is more or less the price of the dollar now. This is what the market expects. So we're starting from an okay base, it seems to me, and there is a feasible resolution like that. Let's also keep in mind that the bondholders are asking for some comparability of treatment with the very large depositors. So if you're being very generous on one side, you're going to have difficulties with the other side.
Thank you, Ishac. Mike, there are some opinions today that Lebanon can do without an IMF program. We can, of course, we can restructure the banking system, and we do not need an IMF program to move further. Other points of view believe that an IMF program is necessary mainly because it will give a stamp of approval, it will give it will give confidence after, of course, a huge loss of confidence in the banking sector after the crisis that hit it. What is your point of view here? Do you think we can do without an IMF program, or do you think that is necessary? And of course, a third point of view that is a third point that is very important here in this debate is the fact that an IMF program is needed for at least minimum assurance that there will be minimum adherence to international standards. I mean, without an IMF program, it means no surveillance. It means we don't know in which direction the restructuring can go. What is your opinion regarding all of these points, Mike?
Well, I think when you hear that we don't need an IMF program and we can do fine, what people are really saying is we don't need to do the restructuring that we would have to do in order to get an IMF program. It really doesn't have anything to do with the IMF. It has to do with what restructuring approach do you want to take or not. And in fact, what they're really saying is that we don't want to do a full and clean restructuring. We want to delay that process somewhat and hope that things, resolve on their own. If you implement everything that is kind of the orthodox restructuring, you do a restructuring where your banks on day one have a clean balance sheet, are liquid, are well capitalized. Your central bank is profitable again and has positive equity, and your government has a sustainable public debt. Then yeah, maybe you don't need an IMF program, but that's not what's going to happen. The idea is that we don't want to do those things, and therefore we don't need to do an IMF program. And I think the biggest risk, and I see this kind of twofold. If you don't have an IMF program, it's going to be very, very difficult to restructure your public debt, because that is a requirement of bondholders to even talk to you. And more than that, it's a requirement to be able to raise future funding. I mean, we just had a conference where the government was talking about $7+ billion of mega infrastructure projects that the country needs. In order for the country to do that, you need to have restructured your debt. You need to have an IMF program in order for the government to be able to give the guarantees that it needs to give, to issue the debt that it needs to issue. So it's a much broader question, I think. Without an IMF program, you're not restructuring your debt. You're not going to be able to get the investment necessary for the infrastructure projects that you need. And you're going to end up in a situation where you don't actually have restructured banks or a central bank, meaning that really it's a status quo. The question I think that should be asked is, do we go down the path of an orthodox restructuring, as every other country has done, or do we maintain the status quo? Now, the fact is we can maintain the status quo. We can maintain it for a very long time, because we have a certain set of circumstances that exists in Lebanon today, which is why we have this stability that we're seeing. And that is that we've frozen 80 billion of deposits. The government is running a massive budget surplus because it's not paying any of its debt. It's not investing in any of the infrastructure that's needed. It's not doing maintenance on infrastructure. We're getting grants to pay basic budgetary expenses like salaries, and we're getting other aid from partner countries. So long as that exists, we can keep doing exactly what we're doing for the next 40 years. But the consequence is that you're going to have a very poor country. And it's very hard for people to see an alternative because things seem stable now. So how do you tell people that, okay, things seem stable now, but if you do this, you're going to have much faster growth and your life is going to be much better? So that's, I think, how I would phrase the no IMF path. It's really just it's a no growth path.
Thank you, Mike. Ishac, IMF, no IMF, comments?
No, I agree with Mike. I mean, not just we need it for all the good reasons that he said, but from what I hear, everybody in government and central bank says that they want it. So, and as I said, the negotiation seems to be quite close. Now, it doesn't mean you sign it tomorrow, because you still have to pass that law in Parliament, right? I mean, the pre-board conditions are quite stiff, and we need to work hard before we get there. It's not tomorrow, but question is really before or after the elections, for example, how fast can we go in parliament seems to be the question. And also, how serious can we start looking at the medium-term framework? Because as we both said, we're looking at one piece of the puzzle, and the time has come to look at the other pieces as well. So we have an overall picture.
Thank you, Ishac. Moving on to one last topic before we start taking questions. The issue of accountability. There are so many, so depositors are obviously expected to take a huge hit from this entire restructuring exercise, particularly that nothing had been done from 2019 until today, and therefore the cost is increasing with time. On the other hand, so there is talk about actually a clawback on interest rates that depositors should have accrued. There is also talk about, of course, addressing illicit deposits, which is definitely welcome. But on the other hand, if we look at other stakeholders, for instance, bank shareholders, shouldn't we be also thinking about solutions that maybe claw back part of the dividends that shareholders have accumulated over time, at other solutions that also look at those that have transferred their money abroad after 2019 and what should be done to those funds that were transferred abroad? Any suggestions in that vein? Anything that should be done that is not being done currently? Mike, Ishac?
Ishac, would you like to go first?
I can try. I mean, clearly, this issue of أموال غير المشروعة anomalies is one first way of hitting and correcting some of the problems of the past. But that's clearly not enough. I mean, litigation is important, and we haven't seen enough of that. There are cases that are well known that need to be litigated. We need to hear. We need the central bank to be more transparent about all that we did not know and all the information they have about, say, the cases involving the previous governor in particular. And the issue you raised about the transfer abroad is one of those issues being discussed as part of the anomalies. I don't know how it will come out in the law, but I mean, clearly, this is a case of insider information and discrimination, and so it has to be dealt with to have a minimum of justice. Yeah.
Mike?
Again, it's like I feel like we should be supportive generally of this government, I think, but I think we also have a duty to be critical where we need to be critical. This to me is a very conservative status quo government that doesn't really want to rock the boat. There's very little talk about accountability. It's been severely deprioritized. I can't think of any, current, high-profile case or any political capital being put into accountability. And it's not just accountability of, illicit deposits. I mean, those are illegal deposits. They shouldn't have been in there in the first place. But there was a whole crisis that happened over 5 or 6 years where 80 billion of losses was generated. Where is the talk about the governance reform at the central bank? Where's the talk about the governance reform at the Ministry of Finance? Where's the talk about the political accountability? I mean, this crisis didn't just happen out of thin air, right? I mean, it's all the same people. Okay, fine. There's a few new ministers, ministers that have good backgrounds, but overall, it's still the same people involved, and there's not really any talk of looking back at what happened over those 5 or 6 years. Who's responsible? What financial crimes were committed? I mean, look, Riyad Salem is out of detention, doing TV interviews now, looking, very healthy. most of the staff at the central bank hasn't really changed. It's still the same, circle. I haven't seen audited financial statements of EDL to even know what had been going on at EDL. And I can go on and on. This accountability is not a priority of this government. I think their perspective is that we should just get things moving, and later down the line we can talk about accountability. And frankly, maybe they were discouraged because people didn't really vote for accountability the last time around, sufficiently. And this is a matter that is so critical, and it's such a sensitive matter that it really requires political accountability, and that can only come from people voting for that, and that just didn't really happen.
Thank you, Mike. Very quickly, so we touched upon hierarchy of claims, gold, no gold, IMF program, no IMF program. There's also one point, the issue of the anomalies and what we're calling anomalies and accountability. There's the point you first raised is about the fact that there's consensus that the first $100,000 will be repaid. But what kind of timeline are we talking about? What do you think would be something logical to expect in that regard? And will it be to every individual, or will it be to every account? So it will be per account or by depositor?
We all want to put, all the old political class ideally in jail. We want to get security, a monopoly of weapons, get electricity fixed, fix the revenue of the state, which is 4 times what it used to be, 4 times less than what used to be, increase the salaries of the public sector, have a growing economy. But we have to realize we are under zero. We've never been in such a bad situation in this country. And we can dream of reaching nirvana and just criticize, or we can try to have pragmatic solution to at least start solving one problem at a time and create momentum to reach nirvana. I think that's what this discussion should be about. There are many things that are not going well. The government has not so much power to solve many things. We still have the same parliament, and if there is voting in a few months, we're likely to have a very similar parliament. So we're not out of the wood. We could have a civil war or an invasion tomorrow. At best, I think we can solve problems one by one progressively and hope that we get into a better place. So, we need to be realistic in terms of what is feasible right now. I think I didn't answer your question, but I was still thinking about
very quickly,
where we're going with this discussion.
There's a long list of questions on the Q&A, and I want to try to address all of them. So just very quickly on the 100K.
Yeah, what's the question on the 100K?
The question is, what's a reasonable timeline, and will every depositor be repaid or every account be repaid? Okay.
I mean, I'll tell you my view on the 100K, that basically it would cost about $20 billion, and the $20 billion are there certainly in terms of asset and in large part in terms of liquidity. The only reason not to pay them.
Where would the $20 billion come from? You're saying they're there. Where would they come from?
The total assets that we've been talking about, central bank plus what's remained in banks, plus the new bonds that can be issued, amount to much more than 20 billion, 40 or 50 billion. So certainly, if these are prioritized, these will be prioritized. There is 20 billion put aside for them in terms of assets. And they need liquidity because some of them would want to withdraw their money. The reserves are there for that, the IMF loan also. But the key point, shouldn't you give them that money immediately, is that you want them to keep it in the banking system. I mean, this is what would be left of the banking system is just these 100K times everyone equal about $23 billion. And so you want them, as in Greece, as elsewhere, you want to give 2-3 years to regain the trust of depositors to have good enough interest rates so that, if they withdraw everything, where are they going to put it? To regain confidence in the banking sector. That's why you don't want to give it in one shot, but over several years. Now, how many years exactly this, I don't know, it's being discussed. We talk of 2, 3, 4 years, something like that.
Okay. Thank you, Ishac. I'm going to go to the chat now. So first of all, Ali Ambayed is saying we call upon the government to release the IMF governance diagnostics of the government and BDL and to explain what is needed and what it is doing to address these governance failures that led to the losses at the BDL. Pakistan, for example, has recently published its IMF governance diagnostic to tell its citizens that it has the willingness and ability to fix these failures. Why don't we do that? Okay, thank you, Alia, for the comment. Christian Saili is asking, do you think any Lebanese bank will ever declare bankruptcy? What conditions do we need to see filled for that to happen? Mike, very quickly.
Well, that's going to be an outcome of whatever the gap law says, and we don't really know. I mean, one of the challenges actually is that, and one of the challenges, because we haven't seen numbers and analysis, is that a lot of this talk about what the gap law might look like and what a restructuring looks like has been done on the basis of looking at the banks in the aggregate as though we have one bank, that has all the deposits. And you can propose a solution that has certain characteristics if that was the case. But now when you take that and you try to apply it to 40 or 60 banks, you're going to find banks that are doing much better than others. And we don't know what is the plan for banks that are not doing so well. I suspect that we probably will see many banks go into liquidation. I don't think banks will declare bankruptcy in kind of the traditional way people think, because if they were going to, they would have done that already. But I think it's likely we're going to see many banks. Listen, I'm talking about this like it's going to happen tomorrow. I think before 2027, probably nothing is going to happen. I mean, I look at the bank restructuring law currently and even the amended form, and it's still so full of deficiencies. I think they're going to run into a million problems when they try to implement, and there's going to be tons of delays. And frankly, we may not even know what tools they use to restructure the banks, because there's no obligation for the banking authority to even tell us what it's doing. So we're very far away from doing that. But ultimately, when we do it, I think, yeah, it's likely there will be some banks that would have to be liquidated. Question is, what happens to the depositors there? Do they just make a partial recovery or what? And I really don't know.
Thank you, Mike Christie. I hope that answered your question. Nasser Saeidi's comment is, you need an IMF program to impose discipline on your government, parliament, and politicians that have destroyed the country by lack of policy action over the past 6 years. So basically, again, the idea on the need of an IMF program to impose discipline. Amal Tarabayzebian is saying we need an IMF program, but not their way of solving. They want to wipe off everything just like that. They want to wipe out all evidence, thus no trust, thus Lebanon would be completely dependent on them. That is unacceptable. Does anyone want to take that? Does anyone want to comment on that, Mike, Ishac, before I move to something else?
I mean, the only thing I'll say is that the starting point has always been, how do we maximize the recovery of depositors given a certain set of constraints that exist? And those constraints are, what does the BDL have? What do the banks have? And how much can the government contribute? Those are your constraints. There's not really much you can do outside of that, because I think the alternative that's been sold to people is that we will promise you that we'll give you something, but in fact, there's no way that that can be given. And so you'll just have this piece of paper that has no value, while at the same time, that piece of paper with no value causes your economy to never grow, because no investor is going to come into a country that has more debt that it can repay. That's why I think a big part of this is the question of accountability. And I don't see it as something that we can do later, because you cannot ask people, or you cannot put people in a position where they need to wait another 4, 5, 6 years to get their money back. And they may not even get all of it while they see that nothing has happened to anybody who was involved in creating this crisis in the first place. I just don't see how that practically can work. And I don't think that. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. Question by Mike Jara. To what Christy, I'll get back to your second question later. Mike Jara, to what extent the use of gold to compensate the depositors will impact the negotiations with the Euro bondholders? Ishac touched quickly on this point. Can we develop it further? Sharing the gold with the bondholders makes this option much less attractive. Mike had already answered saying bondholders have no claim on the gold. They just wouldn't want to be treated worse than large depositors in terms of overall recovery. That is how it may impact those negotiations. Ishac, do you want to quickly touch upon this, please?
I mean, I think there are legal issues about whether the bondholders can touch the gold. But I agree with many people that said if the gold comes to the table, I'm afraid it would just disappear. I mean, as they say, we still have the same rent seekers all around. So I think the general tacit agreement among the Lebanese that gold should be there for the Third Republic to rebuild the country when we have a regime, not just a government, with which we're comfortable and that we trust. Another issue that was, if that's, the legal issues remain to be seen. But certainly, I think if gold is openly given to large depositors, the bondholders would have an avenue to contest it. And let's not forget, some of it is in the US, and they will be, the bondholders use New York law. So certainly there are weaknesses there.
Okay, thank you. I'm trying to also get to there are so many comments, but so Bassem Snej is asking, are you saying, to Mike, are you saying that the whole banking sector is worth $3 billion?
I mean, just based on modeling that I've done, when I look at, post-restructuring, what might be the size of the banks and how much equity they might need, I get somewhere around 2.5–3 billion of equity. That's not the size of the entire banking sector, but that's how much equity they might need. Maybe a little bit less, I don't know, but around that range.
Ishac, do you agree?
I mean, officially now, the value of the banking sector is about $5 billion, considering that their deposits at BDL are whole. So in reality, it's worth about zero. At best, a few hundred, if some banks still have some equity, but it's close to zero. Now, the other issue we were talking about is to recapitalize the new banking sector. How much would be needed? Or if it's $20 billion banking sector, then you need $2 billion to recapitalize it, basically.
So what you're saying is if the total value of deposits in the banking sector is equal to $20 billion, then this means then the total value of the equity should be around $2 billion.
For the future system, after its restructure. Now, how many banks survived? I mean, there's 50-some banks today. My guess is 5 to 10 banks would survive. It'd be plenty for that kind of size of the banking sector. Now, one thing we didn't talk about is, Mike talked a little bit about it, is even if we have a law, the implementation is difficult. And I mean, we have to trust the system. Imagine bank by bank and account by account. We have to check when money was deposited, transferred from pounds into dollars, how much went out, when it was not, where others were not given, so preferential treatment. And this information is with the banks. Do you trust the banks? We need auditors. We need forensic reviews. If this is done without international supervision, will we trust the system? So, I mean, there is also these issues that we have to get to, how to operationalize what we're talking about.
Okay. Hadi Farah is asking the following question. Hello, thanks for the explanations. I have 2 questions. If I had $100,000 in my bank account and had to sell them against $18,000 fresh, will now my account, now at zero, be eligible? Will I get back $82,000? And so let's start with this first.
I don't know. it was discussed at various times that whoever lost would be get it back, but I haven't heard such discussion recently.
Yes, I can confirm that also that the discussion is ongoing regarding this subject, and that it hasn't, at least what we know is that it hasn't been concluded yet. So Hadi, this is still pending. A second point, optimum. $8 billion were potentially distributed via the consulting account of the BDA. This amounts to 15% of eligible stolen deposits. What is being done to investigate? Does anyone have an answer?
Yeah, I mean, the 8 billion of optimum was used to hide the fact that the deposits were being used and no longer able to be repaid. They weren't in and of themselves a use of the deposit. They were just the way that the BDL hid those losses. I think the question I would ask myself is, what is being done to make sure this never happens again? What is the self-reflection that BDL is doing? What kind of internal controls have they implemented? Don't know.
Thanks, Mike. Go ahead, Ishac, please.
No, just to say the governor has promised reforms at the central bank, transparency, new checks and balances, and we await these decisions. Everybody awaits a cleaner central bank and more transparent central bank.
Thank you. Mike Malik is saying banks being liquidated shouldn't affect depositors, as the central bank can step in, take the assets, and assume the liabilities, wipe out the existing equity of shareholders. The central bank can later on sell those banks back to the public. So basically, Mike is answering the question we were asking earlier on whether if banks are being liquidated or if their equity is wiped out, whether this will affect depositors. And he's saying that banks being liquidated should not affect depositors because the central bank can step in and take their assets. Okay. Bassem Snage is saying, can the speakers say something about the fact that all depositors are not equal and therefore not all deposits are legitimate for repayment? I think that was clear from Ishaq's comment. Do you want to say something, Ishaq, on that?
No. I mean, you're absolutely right. Not all depositors are equal, and the illicit money will not be repaid, and big money that got very high interest rate will be clawed back, and so there's a major discussion, and that's a major part of the solution, right? And that will bring some justice also. A good part of the justice will come from there as opposed to tribunals. Again, and we've been saying that again and again, how would that fly in Parliament? To what extent are these things contested in courts later? And already the High Court has, I think, given some omniscience to the government to do that by saying it's true that the Constitution protects private property, but it also protects the national interest. And so there's got to be a balance between these things. And so the question for tribunal, it would be about this balance.
Thanks, Ishaq. Rafiq Badura is asking, what are the next steps to be taken by the government to finalize the gap law before the next election?
Well, I mean, they need to agree to what the gap law will be, and for Parliament to be able to thoughtfully consider it and vote on it, they're going to need all of the analytical work that should be underpinning the gap law. Yeah.
So basically, as we had mentioned earlier, there are the members of the government had already declared that there will be a first draft presented to the Council of Ministers within a few weeks. We are waiting for this first draft to be presented to the Council of Ministers. After that, of course, the government has to agree, as Mike just mentioned. They will have to then send it to Parliament, and then Parliament, the Budget and Finance Committee, or even if a subcommittee is created, will have to discuss this, and then it has to be sent, of course, for a vote by Parliament. This is the process, basically. And of course, the question also, a very important question here is who will champion this? Because the risk here, and we've seen this many times, is that once a draft bill goes out of the government, it will have no champions for these champions to carry this draft bill through Parliament and through the parliamentary deliberations. So there is also a big question on who's going to champion this. And for this draft bill to have a champion, it means it has to have big political buy-in, particularly by the members of the government, of course.
And one thing I'll add, Diana, to what you're saying is, I think you have to remember this is a long process. So a law coming out of cabinet is one step. Going to the parliament committee is another step. Ultimately getting passed is another step. And then implementation is its own step. So we're going to have to check over time whether these laws and this plan is being implemented appropriately. And there's a lot of things we'll be looking to. And I think if I had to pick probably one of the maybe the weakest aspects of this government's work, which is it's a bit schizophrenic because on the one hand you have a lot of positive momentum on things, and on the other hand you have things that make you scratch your head. Someone is going to need to implement this, right? We have, and the government's track record in appointments has been quite, very concerning for me. And the BCC appointments, the BCC will play a very big role in implementation of the bank restructuring. And the fact of the matter is that most of the appointees to the BCC have no banking or bank supervision experience. The government has prioritized, at least as we heard at the Beirut One conference, the creation of more advanced capital markets in Lebanon. The same week that they appointed experts to the Capital Markets Authority with no capital markets experience. And there are more appointments that are going to have to be made that we're going to need to watch out for, because if you don't have the right people implementing these very, very complicated, as Ishac said, these are very complicated things to implement. You need to look at each bank. You need to understand bank balance sheets. You need to understand the depositor structure. If you don't have the right people doing this, then the process is either going to be done unfairly or it'll just never get done.
Thank you, Mike. And a very quick question. We haven't discussed this yet on our call, and I think it's very important for us to discuss it. I mean, of course, with the banking sector in 2019, with the crisis of the banking sector, the cash economy grew even bigger and bigger and bigger, and it was a breeding ground for more illicit activities and for an illicit economy that was growing hand in hand. How do you explain how this cash economy grew? Who is benefiting from it? And how are they benefiting? And what are the ways to counter it? Mike and Ishac, if I can have your views on this, please.
Ishac, you can go first. I answered the last one.
Sure. I mean, it grew because mostly because there are no banks. So, I mean, that's the only way to pay is to pay with cash. People don't trust putting their savings in banks, so they keep dollars at home. They also buy properties. I mean, that's why property prices remain high. Now, it's bad for the economy because you can have more illicit transaction and not pay taxes, but not that bad because people were not paying income taxes anyway. In the future with a banking secrecy law, it'd be really important to push transaction to the banking sector so you can check what incomes are. It helps contraband and illicit activities certainly, but we possibly has less contraband than before with the control over the border that have improved. Money laundering is easier, but I'm not sure it was that difficult, given that now we say الأموال غير المشروعة are up to $10 billion in the banks, right? So it's not that it was terribly difficult. So it seems to me, the cash economy is there because somehow there is a rebound, by the way, in the economy. So it's allowing the economy to function. But on the other hand, the banking sector we need to create, the role would be to try to put enough trust in that system. So will we move from a bank to cash economy back to rule of law, bank-based economy? And it will be increasingly difficult if, as people get used to that kind of totally uncontrolled activity.
Thank you, Ishac. Mike, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I'd like to say something very controversial, which is that I don't think the cash economy is the type of problem people think it is.
The
cash
illicit
economy
economy is, however.
The illicit economy is, yes.
Of
The
course.
illicit economy, to me, the illicit economy is a problem of law enforcement and having a political system, a judicial system that is willing to enforce laws, that has the capacity to investigate and enforce crimes and enforce, financial crimes laws and other criminal statutes. So that's how you stop the illicit economy. And even till today, people are paying bribes at the port in order to not pay customs duties. So that stuff is all still happening.
And probably we should have sorry to interrupt, but we probably should have a longer discussion around this and what's being done around it, because a lot of effort is being undertaken today in order to counter the illicit economy. Maybe we'll have another discussion around this topic just for everyone here. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, no, that's a very important conversation, because I think even if the reason countries don't want a cash-heavy economy, which, by the way, many advanced economies are cash-heavy. So having a cash economy itself is not a fundamental, doesn't make it so that it's a criminal sector. Japan is one example. You barely find places that take credit cards in Japan until recently. But the reason you want a banking system where the deposits go is because you want banks to be able to lend into the private sector. You want the statistical agencies of the government to be able to collect data. You want central banks to be able to exercise monetary policy more effectively, and of course, tax avoidance.
And Hezbollah's
and the only
finance.
way to, sorry?
And Hezbollah's finance.
Well, I don't know that the cash economy affects that, because I think that's a law enforcement matter. And even if, firstly, the only way to stop the cash economy is to have a banking sector and banks that have clean balance sheets and are well capitalized. Anything short of that, you're going to keep having a cash-heavy economy. And in fact, and maybe another controversial point, but I'm not sure that even if we have that, if the banks don't have a radically new brand and maybe new partners, that you would even be able to restore confidence. I don't know. That's a question to be, that's just a question for the government to think about. But I think the question of Hezbollah, they're not going to go and use the banking system. They're going to use cash. And so that is going to continue existing. If you don't want that, then you need to enforce AML and CFT laws.
Anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing. Okay, thank you, Mike. Ishac, any other comment before we move to other questions? Okay,
I'm seeing the comments. It's so interesting. People are very engaged. There are lots of questions up in the air, and actually, it's great to see that the conversation is back on. Hopefully things are happening, and the big question now is, for many, is how they get involved, how civil society groups get involved, how they influence things, how they remind the governor that he promised, why isn't he delivering, as opposed to an amalgamation of issues, that makes it impossible to focus on anything. I think it's a moment where I know many groups are part of civil society organization to think of how they can actually push this in a constructive way.
Two quick questions. Francois Bouheli is asking, the cash in circulation amounts to how many $1 billion? And was it taken into account in bank restructuring? Mike, Ishac, does anyone have a rough figure on top of mind?
I hear 10 billion, but who knows? Mike, you hear of any number?
Yeah, maybe even less than that, but I don't know.
Okay. So a rough estimate, Francois, we have here is 10 billion. To Mike's point also, Alia is saying lack of credible contestable restructuring equals thriving cash economy. Ali Nuruddin is also confirming World Bank estimates in 2022 were at 10 billion. Nicolo Recia is asking, how are the authorities planning to assess which share of which deposit accounts are considered illicit, and what would be the process, and how long would it take? Mike, any insights?
I don't know.
Sorry,
I hear
to
that they will send you a
determine
letter saying, can you prove that the money in your account is clean? But frankly, I don't know even how I would respond.
Okay, Mike, do you have an answer to that?
No, I mean, I think it's a good question, because I think it's going to be a lot more challenging than we think. And we don't know what's the basis of the 30 billion. And if you base your entire restructuring on this number, what if it ends up being 10 billion? If you base your entire restructuring on 35 billion of gold, what if the price of gold crashes tomorrow? So we need to understand, again, I keep saying this because I think it's very important that we need to understand what are the numbers that are underpinning this entire process, so we can understand where the risks are, where the potential areas of delay are, and where the government may be making assumptions that we may not think are practical, and so we can explain what the consequences of those are. I think we need a lot more. We just need a lot more information. We need a lot more transparency. It's very hard to have this conversation with just reading leaks, in newspapers.
Okay, Nicolo is agreeing with you, Mike, that the 30 billion cancellation is a big price and could radically change the landscape. Maybe one final comment before we wrap up. I'm sorry, Aboud Zahir had asked that he asked himself the question, not through the moderator. Aboud, please go ahead if you wish. I know we usually ask questions on chat because it's easier to moderate the discussion, but please go ahead if you wish to ask something. Okay, Nadim Shhad is asking.
Thank you, Diana. So first of all, I suggested to ask the questions ourselves for more democracy and more transparency. Second point, I am following up the mic since more than 5-6 years, and I confirm till now that every word he said since 6 years happened. So it's really incredible how he foresaw everything where we are going, and luckily, that I believed him from the beginning and sold all my money in the bank for 90% of their value, and everybody declared me as a crazy at that time.
Thank you, for your comment.
My second point is that I thought that our present commerce minister was from the same league, but unfortunately, it turned out that he is just a conference organizer, and I'm very upset in this regard. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you, Aboud, for the comment. Of course, we know that the Minister of Economy is working very diligently, of course, alongside other ministers and the central bank governor in order to come up with a plan. We're going to have to wait and see what the plan looks like. Hopefully, we will have a plan as promised within a few weeks on the table of the Council of Ministers, and then we can better assess, and maybe we can have a better call then, another call then, in order for us to also assess. Thank you, everyone, for participating in the discussion. The big question, of course, that remains from now until May is, will we have a gap law from now until May? Will we have an IMF? Will Lebanon succeed in having an IMF program that restores confidence, and an IMF stamp that restores confidence in the economy? Will we be able to conclude a plan that will kickstart growth again, or will Lebanon be stuck in a low, in an economy that is stuck at very low levels? The question, of course, is also who wins and who loses. Definitely, time is not on our side. It's not on the side of depositors, and it's not on the side of Lebanese society as a whole. Lebanon has lost 6 years until now due to a deliberate policy of doing nothing on behalf of the political class and its allies. We're hoping that in the upcoming period, we will see a plan. We'll definitely follow up on the discussions. Thank you very much for a very interesting and engaging discussion, and hope to talk soon. Thank you very much to our speakers.